Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 5 of the Songwriters on Process podcast. My name is Ben Opapari, and since 2010, I've run the Songwriters on Process website, which features more than 200 conversations with songwriters just about their creative process. I'm not a songwriter, but I have a PhD in English literature, and my goal is to treat songwriters the same way that we treat prose writers, as writers, plain and simple. And today I'm talking to Anais Mitchell and Charlotte Cornfield. If you're wondering how I paired these two together, sometimes I do these conversations with two songwriters. My highly scientific way is to follow them both on Twitter, see if they follow each other, which means that they're probably fans of each other's writing and music, and then see if they want to talk. Well, it turns out not only did they follow each other, they're friends. They've known each other for like 10 or 12 years or something. So this was even more fun because they are fans but friends. And so this was a very, I guess, just informal, loose, and fun conversation with both of them. If you know Anais Mitchell, you know that in 2019, she cleaned up at the Tony Awards. She was nominated for 14 awards and won 8 of them, including Best Musical and Best Original Score. And I want to just give you a couple quotes here from the interview, and these really stand out to me. Mitchell said, "The things we strive for already exist in their perfect state in our subconscious. The question is, how do we as songwriters get them out of there?" And Cornfield later on said, "The mellow wistfulness right before sleep is a source of creativity. Being run down and a little emotional is a nice place to write from." We talked a lot about that space right before sleep, and I've talked to a lot of songwriters about this too, that space right before you doze off as a source of inspiration. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. We had a lot of fun, and they talked a lot to each other and asked each other questions. So hope you enjoy. So for now, let's listen to my interview, my Songwriters on Process interview with Anais Mitchell and Charlotte Cornfield. So Charlotte, I guess we'll start with you. Outside of songwriting, do you do other types of writing? Specifically, do you like to journal?
Yeah, I like to free write. I used to keep more of a journal where I would say things like, this happened today, that happened today, I did this thing, but I have less patience for that now. So I just kind of open a notebook and free write whatever comes to mind. And that often becomes stuff that I will use or lines that I will use in the songwriting process. But that's the other kind of, I guess, writing that I do, which I guess feeds into songwriting as well.
Is that something you do? Do you make a point to do that every day, or is it just kind of something that you do when the mood strikes?
I've had like times where I have a good practice of doing it every day, and then things will happen in life and it gets derailed. And so I just try to have something nearby when an idea strikes, even if it's just in my phone.
Anais, how about you?
Do I journal?
Yeah, or just other type. I mean, I know you obviously do other types of writing, but how much of, are you, well, let me say this. Songwriters fall into 3 categories: those that journal, those that don't, but wish they did, and those that don't, but have no desire to ever start. So maybe
I'm the second one.
Oh, okay.
One of those. Yeah. No, I just like Charlotte. I have had phases of my life where I journaled every single day. In fact, yeah, I discovered in the past year, I discovered a box of my journals from high school and college, and I reread them and I burned some of them because they were so embarrassing and terrible. But I find it really, it's good for everything. It's like exercise. It's like going to the gym, it's after you do it, you're like, wow, that was so good for me. My whole day is better. My mental health is better. My creativity is better, but it's really hard to make yourself do it.
Yeah. Do you think it's important, I guess, Anais, to create in some fashion every day? Again, I'm kind of, just based on my experience talking to songwriters, some of them say even if it's crap, you got to do something. Or some people say if you force it, it becomes derivative and it's not worth it. So where do you fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of having a practice and showing up for it.
You are? Okay.
Even if nothing happens. And I think partly that just keeps me calmer if I'm actually showing up. can get up in my head about it if I don't. But also like I have a couple kids now and working on Hadestown, this musical I worked on for years and years. Yeah. That was a very like structured environment. There were, collaborators, they were feeding back on my work. There was deadlines. There was like going to be a bunch of actors in a room and the thing had to exist. And so I really had to have a practice of like going in every day and keeping it alive, keeping the flame kind of alive every day. And I think like with family life, certainly there's two things. One is like, it needs to be more structured because there's less time. And the second thing is, it's also my escape, you know what I mean? To work is like, it's like, oh, I got to go work, and actually it's like, I need to be alone, like time. So it's both of those things.
I think we have 4 kids. And so I found that having kids has made me a much more disciplined writer and probably much more efficient because of kind of what you were saying is if you only have 2 hours a day, you've got to make sure that you do something those 2 hours. Like if I'm not, I think, oh my gosh, this is the time I've got to be doing something. So, and before I get back to Charlotte, I guess my one follow-up to that is, does all that playwriting experience where you do have people relying on you with deadlines, has that made you a more efficient songwriter? I guess, do you write well under deadlines now? Songwriters tell me they're notoriously bad with deadlines. But do you write well under deadline now? Like if I said to you, I've got to have something in 2 hours, do you thrive on that? Or is it, oh my gosh, I don't know if, maybe freeze up?
Yeah. Oh my God. So many thoughts about this. I love a false deadline. That's my favorite, my favorite. Yes. Give me a deadline. I will not meet it, but then I will freak out before it and do something. And then that will eventually lead to something like fascinating that I did last year for the first time in my life. And people have been telling me to do this for as long as I can remember. And I was always like, nah, that's not how I write. That's not how I roll. But basically it was like a group of songwriters getting together to write a song, and not physically together, but virtually together to write a song a day. For a week. And if you didn't submit your song by the time you went to sleep, you were lovingly but firmly not in the group for the rest of the week. And so it was very, there was accountability there. And I loved it. I was so frightened to do it because I think of myself as a very slow, methodical writer. But I found that like the practice of having to say yes to whatever the idea was, just having to say yes to it and trust it and go with it, really like gained me access to things that I don't think I could get if I was just banging my head against a wall, Yeah.
Yeah. Charlotte, how about you? Where do you fall into that whole deadline, writing every day, just, kind of routine?
Well, I really like deadlines. I like having to finish something. Otherwise, I'll just leave a lot of things hanging. And similar to Anais, I didn't do a song a day thing, but some friends from out west started a group where we got together every week, every Tuesday night on Zoom, and had to have something new to show. And just having that deadline of having to finish a song every week really, I found was really great for me. And like Anais was saying too, I had just flowing with ideas in a different way and not self-editing as much and saying yes to things was a really great practice. And I found that I was doing things that I wouldn't have otherwise done, or saying things that I might have before been like, I don't know if I want to say that. That's embarrassing or whatever.
And I don't want to make this a pandemic related question, but there was an article, I think about I have no idea, maybe 6 or 8 months ago, by the theater critic of the Washington Post and Peter Marks. And he talked about how Shakespeare wrote King Lear during the plague, and how this idea, he couldn't wait until this all ended because artists were going to have so much, you have so much time, you're not touring, and so much to draw from, and at a large expanses of time. And I can't tell you, I don't think any songwriters, maybe 2 or 3 in the past year and a half, have told me this has been a good time for them to write. Because of those expanses of time, that's made it more difficult to write with those expanses of time. As someone says, you have a year and a half to do it or something, that actually is more difficult. But that tends to be, I think, people who don't talk to songwriters, that tends to be that common theme, like, oh, you guys must have so much, so much to draw from in this past year and a half. But I'm hearing from both of you, right, that deadlines you tend to thrive under deadlines. So maybe when you have those large expanses, it's not as easy, right?
It was good for me. It was good for Taylor Swift also, apparently.
Yeah.
But for me, it was very different. It was, there was a huge shift that happened in my life. Like, I was living in New York City. I've been working on this musical for like 1/3 of my life. I was pregnant with like our second kid and left New York at the beginning of the pandemic in New York, 9 months pregnant, just like fled to my my homeland, which is Vermont, and had the baby a week later. And then I just was like on this farm where I grew up. I was living in my grandparents' house, where I was just a very like joyful, space from my childhood memory. And I felt like a portal to my childhood, to a kind of freedom and like invisibility, and just like the stillness was so healing for us, for our family. And I wrote a lot in a way that it wasn't about the deadline. It was just reconnection. I felt really like excited to be reconnecting with just like me and the muse in a room. And so, I don't know what it was like for you, Charlotte, but that it did feel, but I know other writers who really had the opposite experience. Like, they were just processing what has happened to my career, like what has happened to my friends, like this whole thing. And it wasn't a creative time for them. Yeah.
Charlotte, what about you?
Yeah. My experience was, there were definitely some similarities. When the pandemic hit, I was at the Banff Center and doing a songwriting residency. And so I was already in this mode of spending my days writing. And then everything kind of blew up and we got sent home early, but the calendar was wiped clean. I started experiencing that same stillness that I'd never felt, because there had always been so much background noise and so many logistics and things to figure out, that I just really embraced it, and was also thinking a lot about my childhood and experiences of being younger and youth, and just started delving back into memories. And that quiet space just offered so much solace and time to really do that. And it was a really fruitful time for me, for sure.
The other thing is that I think people struggle with is just how difficult it is to write under heavy emotional weight. This idea also that, you have a lot to write about because you're heavy emotional weight. But at some point, it just becomes difficult to write if that weight is too heavy. So that kind of reminds me, I'm going to throw a Hemingway quote out here. Hemingway said he could never write about Paris when he was in Paris. He needed distance to be able to write about something. So I'd love to hear both of you. Charlotte, we'll start with you. Is it easy to write about something when you're in the moment, or do you need distance to be able to write about something, whether it's a place or an emotion or an event or anything like that?
It's funny because I think I would have answered that question differently a couple of years ago, because I used to be all about like hit when the muse strikes and when everything is blowing up, and just that's how I would process my emotions, is sit down and write it out. And when I was in that depth of feeling, and this record, these songs happened in a very different way. I'm in a place in my life where I feel like very settled and kind of happy, and I'm able to look back on things and think about them like, oh, that was a really wild experience, and what were the details of that thing, and having that reflective distance has been really cool. And it's really nice to be able to write from that perspective now. And I think I maybe would have said before, oh, you got to be like in it, but I don't feel that way anymore. I think you just had to have been in it at one point.
Yeah. How about you, Anais?
Yeah. I wrote a few songs on this new record about New York City that I wouldn't have let myself, like back to the Hemingway quote, like I couldn't have written them in New York. one of them is like this song called Brooklyn Bridge. And when I was living in New York, that phrase came into my head, over Brooklyn Bridge. And I thought it was so beautiful, but I also didn't want to, it felt like an over romanticization of Brooklyn, and I didn't want to it just was like uncool to be like Brooklyn in a song. But then when I left the city, I was like, oh my God, I miss it so much. And this is how I feel. And I'm just going to let myself write this. And I don't care if it's cool or not. And, there's something about, I tend to I sort of love nostalgia. Like it's actually a world I like to be in kind of. And, it's a very generative feeling. It's beautiful to be able to, look back on a time or a place and see all the beauty in it that is actually hard to see when you're in the moment of it and you're dealing with actually being alive in it.
Right. So let's talk about the ritual of the process. I'm fascinated. I read all these Paris Review interviews and I'm fascinated by it. So for me, I have to have a ritual that's important for my confidence. I write in that chair behind me, but I never revise in that chair. So there are things I do. There's a time of day when I know that I got my best writing done and I won't write. I'm much more of a morning person. Things like that. For me, that's confidence because I just, if I've had success back there before, maybe it'll happen again. So I guess, Anais, we'll start with you. How important is the environment, time of day, place, room, chair, things you have to have with you when you write?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'm like you, the morning is the golden time. And it's the one, 20 morning minutes is worth a couple hours in the afternoon, And so I like to hit it as soon as as humanly possible. And with, a music career, there's other jobs you got to do. There's a lot of email. Sometimes we call it playing the keys, so much email and the virtual stuff that happens. And I find I gotta do the writing first, because if I go to that place, you cannot come back from it, So that's the main thing for me is to go first thing. And I love coffee. I drink 2 cups of coffee a day. So is
there a room or that you'd like to write in or a certain chair?
Yeah, I'm in it right now. So apparently I do other things in this chair than write songs, but I tend to write. It's not that cool, but I'll write in a blank email on my phone. I like to see the text typed out. Somehow it feels more legitimate that way. I'll write in a notebook also, but there's something about seeing it in print that I'm look at that line. You know what I mean?
Wait, so not like a Word document, you actually write in a blank email.
Yeah. Okay. I will write in a Word document also, but I will often write in a blank email, because then there it is. If you go, somewhere else, you got your phone, you can call it up. You have an idea, you can put it in your blank email.
Yeah. So one follow-up to that is, because you mentioned your phone, I'm sure most songwriters, you have thousands of voice memos and things in your phone with song ideas. Do you have a filing system? I mean, I am amazed. So some of them do. I've heard some people say they have Excel spreadsheets with words and lines and themes. Others just have nothing and they have to scroll endlessly. So I think, oh my gosh, it'd be easier, to have some kind of filing system, but I'm sure you have a lot of those notes. Is there anything you do when you have to go back and say, oh, where was that line or where was that melody?
I don't have a good system. But often, usually I'm working on one thing at a time and I won't forget, Yeah. A melody for me, it's if the melody is really inspiring me, I won't forget it. And if it's not that special, it's kind of okay if it drifts away in my voice memos. I'm not actually advising this to anyone. I'm really just saying this is how I seem to do it.
There's one songwriter told me he has, I think he's up to 60 pages, a 60 or 80 page Word document. organized by theme and by emotions within that theme. So like relationships, happy relationships, sad relationships, all these different. And then when he needs ideas, it's an easy place to draw from.
Wow. Or you get like a piece of music and you're like, sounds like a sad relationship song. I'll go to
Exactly.
this.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Charlotte, how about you? What's that? Do you have a ritual to your process?
A little bit. Coffee is very important to me. It's so much so that it turned up in like 3 or 4 songs on this latest record. Like just, yeah, coffee is a ritual, waking up, having a coffee. And like Anais said, I do find the morning is the best time as well, because as soon as my head gets clouded with other things and minutia, it's just harder to access that space. And yeah, I moved into the place where I live now, my partner's house, like at the beginning of the pandemic. And this is the first time I've had a dedicated music studio room space. And that's been amazing, just to be like, okay, I'm going to walk in there and close a door and spend this time specifically writing, focusing on songs and stuff. So yeah, so that's sort of the ritual. And then in terms of my systems, I also don't feel strongly about them and wouldn't recommend them necessarily. But I do really relate to the thing you were saying, Anais, about if I don't remember it, then it's not worth remembering. Not everything, but the sort of those key melodic ideas. So I do keep voice memos, but I don't always go back and listen to them. Or I use them mostly when I'm trying to finish a song, to just get to the finish line on it, to be like, how am I going to end it? Am I going to do a double chorus? Am I going to do a few things out? And then I'll just kind of workshop it, listen back until it feels right. But my thing that I do the most is have a lot of Word documents. And I often have many open at once. And I'll be in one and be like, okay, not feeling this one right now, I'm going to jump to another one. So I am quite scatterbrained in that way. But I do find it very useful because it keeps me writing even if I feel stumped on something. And I think lyrics are the thing that I really return to, sort of more so than the music aspect. Like I find that comes together a little more naturally and quickly. But lyrics I definitely spend the most time on.
So before we talk about lyrics, I have a question to both of you. I could probably do an entire website dedicated to the brands of pens and the colors of ink that songwriters like, and even the types of paper. I am fascinated by the loyalty. So do either of you use pen and paper with lyrics, or strictly computer?
I do. I always have a journal going, and it's like, a lot of times it devolves into like to-do lists. So it'll just be like, and then the shopping list and whatever, but it's like, it's a book that I can go to. And I used to be into like a moleskin, and then I passed through that phase. I'm like, why am I paying that much money for it? And it's small, And so I like these nice big kind of recycled ones that you can get at the food co-op that I belong to. And I like a flowing black ball. It's not a ball pen. It's like it's a rolling ball, right? Like it's going to flow. Yeah. I like that.
Do you have a color? So did you say ink? Does color of ink matter?
It's kind of got to be black. I mean, I'll take what I could get if I have to work with blue, but I want it to be black.
All right. Yeah. Charlotte, how about you?
I'm all over the place. I guess that I am a moleskin person, and I got this one. I would never have picked this color, but it was just the only one they had. I'm not very particular. I'll write in any notebook and I'll use any pen, but I do prefer black ink as well. Like blue ink, like freaks me out. It throws me off a little bit.
But the other thing I was going to say is I hear hotel pens. For some reason, songwriters love a good hotel pen. And maybe that's because they've had good luck in a hotel room writing a song. And so it brings them back, back to that space.
I think the point is that they love the hotel.
They love the hotel. Could be nothing more
better than a hotel.
Right. So I am also fascinated by the role of movement in the songwriting process. And I interviewed a couple weeks ago. I'm posting it today or tomorrow with Yola, and we had this whole discussion about the role of movement. Now, we could break this up in a couple of ways. One, there's like the movement of doing menial tasks. So I've heard songwriters tell me they get so many ideas through vacuuming, gardening, cooking, chopping vegetables, something menial where your mind doesn't have to focus on things. In the shower, I hear that a lot too. And then there's the more active movement, which is walking, biking, hiking, running, things like that. So I'd love to talk about that because I've actually written about this, an article about this in the Washington Post a few years ago because I'm a big runner, and there's a lot of research, tons of research, laboratory research, connecting aerobic exercise and the immediate impact it has on higher order thinking, creativity. I mean, as if you go to run or you exercise, and then for about 90 minutes afterwards, you're in this sweet spot because of a chemical called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that gets secreted in the brain through exercise. And so after about 30 minutes and moderate exercise, which is like a fast walk, and they've done this in labs, put people on a treadmill for 30 minutes and then give them tests afterwards. Those people always score higher than people that didn't exercise. So this is in the lab, not like snake oil science. So I'd love to talk about that. Anais, we'll start with you, if that ever plays a role in your process, and we can do the exercise route or the vacuuming route. Mm-hmm. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's incredible to hear you say that. And that's like, maybe what I need to do is wake up, do the half hour of exercise, and then do the writing. Cause I'm always like, I can't go to the gym because I got to write. But anyway, I had this experience when I was living in Brooklyn. I briefly was like, I was sort of borrowing my friend's studio to write in. And he lived around the park from me, around Prospect Park. So I lived in Park Slope and he was in Lefferts Garden. And so I would get on my bike in the morning to go to work at his place. And I'd get on the bike and I'd ride over there. And sometimes I would ride all the way around the park again, just do the loop one time and then go to his house. I always had ideas on the bike. I always had ideas on the way to hit the house. Then I would get to the studio, get to the desk, and nothing else would happen for the rest of the day. And it just was like so clear to me that there was something going on with the motion. I also find that driving, I know this isn't like exercise, but if you can drive alone without distractions, that's been like very generative for me.
But I think that's probably the menial. I mean, yes, you are paying attention, but driving can become a repetitive movement if you're driving in the same place, right?
Part of your brain is busy. An important part of your brain is distracted. So it's not getting in the way of the other part that has to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is, I've heard it's so funny because the vacuuming comes up. I've had 2 discussions recently about vacuuming and the role in the songwriting process. Like anything menial, like I said, it can be, I do hear gardening, cooking, things like that, that people get the ideas. And then, not only the vacuuming, but it's the sound of, yesterday I interviewed a songwriter said the sound of a dishwasher tends to, sometimes create melodies, and that's separate altogether, not movement. But so really quickly, Charlotte, before I get to you, so it's 30, just so you know, it's 30 minutes. 60% max heart rate, which is like it's like a moderate walk. Now, the good news is that it's not dose responsive. So 60 minutes isn't twice as good as 30 minutes. And 90% max heart rate isn't any better than 60%. So you don't have to like bust your butt. But the out lab, it's very clear. I've written about it. It has enormous implications. And we have kids, and it has a lot of implications for recess time with kids, about how kids need to be exercising in schools. And this idea, that we've got to do away with that because they need to be in the classroom is so antithetical to what we should be doing with them.
That makes much sense. And what can I say one more thing about it?
Yeah.
Like, I think this is the thing about the waking up, like you feel you have access to things when you first wake up. And there's even a time in my life when I was trying to take naps just so I could have that experience twice in a day. And they're very similar. The feeling of waking up and then the feeling of having exercise. Like, there's a time if you're on a tour, maybe you can identify, Charlotte, like you're like, what's you like jet lagged or whatever, you get to the thing, there's 2 hours, you're at a hotel, say, for 2 hours, and then you got to go. And it's like, you could sleep or you could work out. And they kind of both would serve the same purpose. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. So Charlotte, how about you? What is that? The expansive role of movement in all of its forms, does that have an impact on your creative process?
Definitely. And it's funny because I have this very distinct memory of like that tour that we did out West, like in 2012. I remember there was a day where we had traveled a bunch and like I bumped into Anais in the hotel or something. And like, we were both like, oh yeah, it was rough that like we couldn't get any exercise today. I remember you saying that. And like, we were in kind of like deep winter, small town. But yeah, I really feel the movement thing intensely, and walking is really the thing that I love to do, and was a huge pandemic writing sort of catalyst for me, because I was also experiencing the streets of Toronto in a totally different way because everything was so quiet and dead. And I would just walk for hours. And that time is when I really started looking back on my entire life and the nostalgia of, because I live in the city I grew up in. I was just thinking about experiences of being different ages and stages, living here and also coming back after a long time away. And I found that just like motion of walking and the stimulation of not just getting exercise, but seeing things along the way, and maybe sometimes bumping into people, and just the different sort of landscapes of the city, I found really inspiring. And it's still kind of my go-to activity. But the other one that came up for me that was kind of like a portal to another time in my life was that I picked up a skateboard again during the pandemic for the first time since I was like 14, because I was really, really into it when I was a tween. I was obsessed. And then I just started injuring myself all the time. And my parents were like, if you want to keep taking music lessons, you need to stop breaking bones.
Oh, man.
Yeah. So I borrowed a skateboard from my brother, and like my partner also got a skateboard, and we were just like cruising around the dead, quiet, empty streets. And that just like brought back so much for me and really allowed me to channel my inner child and have some empathy for that person. And it was a really cool experience, and that really ended up on a bunch of the songs, I think.
The other thing I've heard often is that moment when you're just about to fall asleep, that ideas have come to songwriters, not when they wake up, but that moment when they're just about to fall asleep. And I read the book. I don't know if you read the book, the novel Homeland Elegies, a couple of years ago. The authors, he won the Pulitzer Prize for a novel, and his last name is Akhtar, I think. And he's the protagonist of the book is an author also. And so there's this discussion of how much of this is actually his real life. But he says one of the things he does in the book is he ties a pencil to his finger before he goes to bed, so that if he ever wakes up in the middle of the night or first thing in the morning, he's ready to write. Because someone told him that even if you wait 5 or 10 seconds fumbling for that writing instrument, that idea is gone. So he tied. Now it's pretty dangerous, I guess, to tie a pencil. But I'm curious how often that's happened. Anais, we'll start with you. With either when you wake up or in the middle of the night or before you go to sleep, has that a productive time for you?
Yeah. Wow. So many thoughts. One is that, like, man, sometimes I think I have an unhealthy habit of not setting the song down when I lay down. Like, I'll lay down and I'll continue to, and I'll think I'm going to be productive now somehow, even though I'm like, it's time to go to sleep. And I'll end up sort of like fitfully working on a thing in my dream life. And then I'm not sure that it's productive. However, I have had some powerful dream experiences. Like, I have come out of dreams with melodies at times. And I just remember having this one really powerful dream one time when it was actually during a time when I was feeling pretty stuck creatively during the day. And I was kind of like putting in the time and nothing was happening. And I had this dream in which David Rawlings came to me in the dream, Gillian Welch's partner, and said, "Would you like to hear the new Gillian Welch album?" And and this was in the time before they put out The Heroine, the Harvest. So it'd been like 7 or 8 years, 9 years. I don't know. Everyone was like desperate for the new Gillian Welch. And I said, yes, and I sat down with him and we listened to this entire album together in the dream. And I could hear everything, the lines, the production of the thing. And my takeaway was every line is abstract, but the sum total of these abstract lines is totally concrete. And I started to say this to David Rawlings, and I was like, Dave. And then I was in the dream, like, wait a minute, I've never met David Rawlings. Like, well, how come I just called him Dave? And then I realized I'm in a dream. This is not the new Gillian Welch record. In fact, it's my album, if I can get out of the dream with it. And so I'm in the dream. I haven't had a lot of these experiences, but this was like one of those lucid dream moments where I was like, I had the sensation of that I was gathering up these songs like leaves, like a pile, like an armful of leaves. And I was like, got out of bed, ran into the next room and wrote down what I could remember. And it was just one stanza at that point, which I never ended up using. But the feeling that I came out of this dream with was that all of these things that we're striving for in the daylight, they already exist in their perfect state in the unconscious, subconscious mind. And the question is, how do you get them out? How can you get them out of there? They're already in there. And like, it's almost as if there's guards at the gate of the vault, and they're not going to let you just go in and out and carry things in and out. Like, you would go crazy. You need to like prove yourself by like sitting there in the daytime. And then hopefully you're like worthy of this thing being bestowed. I don't know. It was just a thought that those things exist already.
Yeah.
We're not building them line by line. They're like already there.
Right. Charlotte, how about you? How often does that moment of sleep play a role in your process?
Yeah. I mean, well, first I just want to say I love that story.
That's an amazing story. I know.
Story. Yeah. And I've had not that specific of an experience from a dream state, but I have definitely like woken up and been like, oh, I need to write this thing down. Or I did have a dream that turned into a song called Pac-Man that's on my new record that was like a slight distortion of real life and a hypothetical as to what would happen if like I saw this person from the past, and it all sort of like took place in the dream. And then I woke up and wrote it down. And that was a really cool experience and kind of opened my eyes up as to what can come from dreams, and that thing of listening to the subconscious and that resting state when all that stuff that is there is actually percolating and happening. And in terms of your question about the nighttime versus the daytime, I do think that other sort of special time of day I find, though I rarely access it, is the sort of right before going to sleep. I find like ideas flow, and there's this sort of mellow wistfulness that I always have at that time of day. That's like a little like run down and maybe a bit more emotional. And so I find that can be a nice place to write from as well.
A couple more questions. And Anais, I don't know if you can answer this, but or both of you actually, but songwriters have moved from urban environments to I guess a much more pastoral environment, or vice versa. Did you notice that the music, some of them have told me this, that the music actually changes because of the environment is different that they're writing in, and it could be as simple as the fact that, hey, you're writing and there's trees outside rather than car horns, or the birds or something like that. But do you notice that moving actually affects the music at all? And maybe it doesn't, but I've heard this a lot from people.
I definitely identify with what you're saying about the imagery, like the imagery that would wind up in your lyrics. And I don't know that that's a thing that it's not a conscious process, but that it just happens that way. I remember that, I started writing Hadestown in Vermont and was living in Vermont in this really rural spot where the seasons are very strongly felt. The winter is long and hard and cold. And and the summer is this brief, it's like the briefest and most amazing of parties. It's always over too soon. And a lot of that imagery is very important to Hadestown, and like this kind of cyclical story. The seasons are really important, and the natural world, this idea of like the natural world above, and then this kind of industrial world below. And so then it was interesting that, partway through the development of this long gestation of the show, like I moved to New York, and then I'm like living in this industrial space. I wrote a bunch of it in this like closet, basically like a drum closet, in a band practice space in Gowanus, which is already just like kind of an unsightly industrial wasteland. It's getting turned into a cool spot. But that those images, they found their way into the songs. And as for the music, I'm not sure what to think about that. And I also do feel that the striving for the thing that you're not is equally important. Do you know what I mean? Like the way that Gillian Welch like comes from California, but was striving toward this Americana that was more of a heartland sound, and then really came to embody that more than someone maybe that came from like Kentucky or whatever. And the same with like Bob Dylan. I think about like, his was more New York than people that were from New York when he, arrived there from wherever, Midwest. There's a way in which like there is a trying on of clothing, and the things that we romanticize are like there's wind blowing our vessel, and so there's a way in which that is equally important to like where you are, kind of like what you're striving towards is equally important.
Again, I'm going to Hemingway quote, but it's related to the process. And Hemingway always said artists or writers should go to art galleries to get inspired. So I guess let's talk about how inspiring other types other types of art are to you. And then the question is, let's talk about the reading. Who do you like to read? Who are some of your favorite authors? And because of course I'd love to talk about that as well. So Anais, we'll start with you. If other art plays a role in your songwriting process, and also who are some of your favorite authors? Who do you like to read?
Wow. Man, this is like this whole conversation is like, I'm coming out of it with a like to-do list of things that I go to an art gallery. How long has it been? Get hungover, go to an art gallery, get 30 minutes of exercise, light exercise. So what I like about that Hemingway quote is that like art speaks to other kinds of art, and it's easy to get caught up in your own thing. And we have so much baggage when we're listening to other music and songwriter. And I love music. And but the discovery of it is difficult for me. And I wade through things, and I feel ego feelings, and like I could do that, or like how come they're getting all this attention? That's not that interesting, or stuff like that. And it's nice to go to an art form where there's none of that. It's so pure to just experience it. I do love visual art. I'm in this world right now where we're renovating my grandparents' house to move into it on the family farm in Vermont. And so I've never done this before, but we're like designing the interior like choices of the house. And so there's a whole world of visual details that I never even knew existed. Like when you buy a door, like Charlotte, I'm looking at your door, and actually yours too. There are panels in it, and there's like different kinds of patterns it's called ovolo versus shaker sticking. Anyway, now you know. So that's kind of a visual world that I've started to get immersed in and enjoy, like just that, wow, people are making these choices all the time. Most of the time, I don't even think about that existing. As for like books, again, I'm in a zone with these two kids, man. One of them is 1.5. Like I barely am reading. But I have loved, like in my life, I have been like very inspired by and like romanticized the sort of like classic kind of expatriate writer communities from like decades ago. I'm rereading this Lawrence Durrell book right now, very slowly because of my children. But one of the Alexandria Quartet books, which I read in my 20s and made like a huge impression on me. Like Lawrence Durrell and like Anais Nin and Henry Miller and Hemingway's in there, and all those writers that were like part of a community of writers living in some beautiful place that wasn't their birth home, and being inspired by each other, and sort of like that idea of collective genius that sort of crops up sometimes in different cities. I've always found that very, very romantic.
So Charlotte, how much do you get to read?
I've been trying to read more. I love reading, and I find I sort of need to be in a slightly relaxed headspace in order to do it, or else I just get distracted with things. Like, I feel like many of us, I'm trying to change my relationship to like my phone and just reading things on my phone. And so I find books have always been a really great escape. And I tend to gravitate towards contemporary fiction and things that, like I do in songwriting, things that feel like relatable. So I read Sally Rooney's new book recently, and I really loved it, but I felt like, oh, this is like too close. It's like listening to, like what you were saying, Anais, about listening to a songwriter who's doing a similar vibe. It's like, it's great and I love it, but I can't like disconnect and escape in the same way. And so I read this trilogy by Canadian author named Eden Robinson that's like Indigenous magical realism. It's called Son of a Trickster. And her writing is just so fun and weird. And I've never read anything quite like it. And I really liked just delving into those stories. And that was something, those 3 books, I totally loved reading them in the last year. And I also read a Toni Morrison book, God Help the Child, recently, which was beautiful and I loved. I'm trying to just kind of not gravitate to the same things all the time, but.
What's the Sally Rooney book? Like, what's the new one called?
What's it called? I have it downstairs. I forget what it's called.
Yeah. I read one last year and I like totally devoured it. Like,
you can just like read it in a sitting kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I just find the way that she writes human relationships is really cool and interesting, and people, like, I can relate to the like examining your own actions and inner workings and trying to understand someone else's mind. Like, she just does that in a really interesting way.
Does that ever influence your songwriting at all?
Yeah, I would say so. I think a lot about conversations when I'm writing songs, and conversations that I've had. And I really like dialogue as a tool because like I don't have to write it all myself. Like, some of it someone said before and was already there. But I just really like that sort of human interplay of language and words.
And that's it for today's Songwriters on Process episode with Anais Mitchell and Charlotte Cornfield. As a reminder, you can find all of my interviews with over 200 songwriters on my Songwriters on Process website at songwritersonprocess.com, going all the way back to 2010. It's all free, and there are no ads. You can read them, watch them, or listen to them. So until next time, see you later.